He's making his maiden voyage on the NIO Summit stage, but he's got a lot to give. Come on down, Charlie Smith.
Hello. Good. Hello, hello. My name's Charlie. I'm a data analyst at NextAfter. If my face looks familiar, I was also working registration, and I might have handed you a bag of rocks. So you might recognize me from that, but the real job is I am a data analyst. The team, myself and my colleagues at NextAfter, what we do is we work with a wide array of organizations, and we ingest a whole bunch of data. And with that data, we're really there to ask and answer really important questions. So those questions come from a whole lot of different places, but the end goal is that we're trying to reach more donors, get more names, and raise more money. When we kick off an engagement with one of these organizations, we have a big old call. We get a whole bunch of development staff there, myself and my colleagues on the NextAfter side. We have questions for them, but a lot of times they are coming in with questions of their own. They have a lot of ideas of how their program is performing and what they've done in the past. Sometimes those ideas are based in fact. We go through the process and we're like, you guys are right on the money, but there are other times where these ideas that they have about their program just isn't backed up by data. They end up being myths. Now, this isn't Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot, but if someone does have data on those, come on up, you can take my time. I'd really love to hear about that. But what we go through are the smaller myths about fundraising and where they think that data is coming from and what they think it supports. So for today, with this time here, I'll walk through two of the main ones that we hear most often and how we can test those and how we can prove if those are right or wrong. But to start, to kind of explain the process that we go through with asking these questions and building these experiments, I want to start with a team that has busted more myths in the most entertaining way I can imagine, and was quite a formative team in my middle school and high school years. And so with a raise of hands, who remembers these guys? Yeah, okay. This is the right audience, cool. So for those of you who weren't whooping and hollering there, this is Mythbusters. There's two guys, Adam and Jamie. These guys never shied away from a question. And I remember coming home, and over 30 minutes, they would take the craziest idea, build some amazing contraption, and before the credits rolled, they would always say, hey, is this busted, or is this confirmed? They would tackle everything. Is the 5-second rule true? For those of you that don't remember that episode, it's actually, they said no. So they saw they dropped 1 million pieces of food on the floor, and they saw there was not a statistical difference between food being on the floor 3 seconds or 5 seconds. They also yelled at ice. Does yodeling cause an avalanche? I swear we'll get back to fundraising in a second, but this is not us necessarily. My manager, Brad, maybe can relate to that face, but this is what they did. And this one actually was true. So he screamed at it. They found different ways to move that ice down a ledge. Keeping with this week's theme too, they had a whole episode on Indiana Jones. So they would take turns whipping each other with a bullwhip, seeing if they can disarm themselves and get that gun out of their hand. This one actually was just plausible. So there is a third category there. They said, hey, we can't say if this is confirmed or busted. It's probably likely. But in the end, this process was so simple, yet very effective, very entertaining. And we're going to apply this to fundraising. But really, the research for this was really fun. I got to walk through a bunch of these episodes. The process really just broke down into finding a widely known idea or belief. A lot of times this was taken from pop culture, movies, things like that. They would take in that idea. They would build a test that would eliminate as many of those unknown variables as possible. They set out with a single question, and they would try to eliminate everything else to say, hey, is this true or is this false? And then the part that they're famous for is they would use those results to determine, hey, is this confirmed, busted in those few instances? Is it at least plausible? And for bonus points, they blow stuff up. So any chance that they could use pyrotechnics, C4, you name it, stuff would be blown up. They would build these amazing contraptions, and then by the end of it, it was in shambles. So for today, no pyrotechnics. There's not going to be any fire behind me, but we can apply this same process to fundraising. Those same steps. This is what my team does. This is what I really love about the job itself and the work we get to do, is building those tests and seeing if it's true or false. So the first myth, the first things I want to walk through here today, again, these are broad ideas that these teams come to us with, and they say, hey, through this process, we really want to test this out. And so that first one is small donors are not worth the investment. There's a whole lot of ways you can tackle that problem, but for our test for today, we want to first set up the framework and how we can go about experimenting with that. So what we did is we took a look and we took a whole bunch of current major donors and we used these different ranges to see what was that first gift they made and where did they start their giving process at. So we set up our broad-based level at under $1,000. Mid-level was $1,000 to $9,999. And our major donors for this study here was any donor over the past 5 years that gave more than $10,000 in a single gift. In total, we were able to look at 16,000 major donors. So those are 16,000 individuals that's made a gift at one time in the past 5 years that was over $10,000. Now when we looked, and again, the main experiment here is we want to see where did these major donors start? We know where they ended. We know that they gave more than 10,000, but where did they start? We saw 44% their first gift when they gave was at that major level. Another 22% were at that mid-level, which left the remainder 35% at broad base. So in total, we did see more than half of major donors started giving a smaller amount than where they ended up. Now this is where the real, in my opinion, the real fun begins, because there's a whole lot of other questions we can ask around that, a few which we'll cover here today. But we can see that whether it's through concerted efforts by the organization, and there's definitely some outside things at play there, maybe coming into a whole lot of money, some other things that might happen in that donor's life, but more than half of those major donors were not starting out as major donors. They were coming from the mid-level and broad-based level. But looking at this portion here, this 35%, now we like showing this, we like running this analysis for organizations to show them the makeup. The question we often get is there's a big piece of this that is missing, and that's time. What does it take? How much time lapses between these broad-based donors moving up and becoming major donors? So for that too, we ran a study here. This is the years it takes for a broad-based donor to become a major donor for a whole lot of different organizations. And we can see there are a whole lot of different results up here. There are some organizations that were able to do that on average less than 5 years, and there's other ones that just took a lot longer time. But what we can say is that on average, we saw it takes about 8 years. So that leads, again, to further questions that we'll get to, but a big part of our process is making sure that the question we start out with is answered and that we address that first. So when we look at this initial question of small donors aren't worth the investment, when we look at it at the lens, are these donors going to become donors that can give more over their lifetime? And I've been waiting all day to do this. You'd say it's busted. Dang, we got more to get through. We got more to get through. So yeah, more than half of major donors do start at lower giving levels, but of course this isn't a TV show. Credits aren't going to roll behind me here. This is where it's very different than what we see, and that this leads to further questions. The insights and how we enforce strategy and change that comes from the further questions we want to ask. There's a whole lot of questions that come up just from this on understanding why broad-based donors upgrade in the first place. I don't have time for all those today, but some of the ones that we would want to go through, and these are things that we tackle with each individual organization, because this is extremely different depending on how the team operates, is what giving channels are common from those broad-based donors that end up upgrading. Are broad-based donors that upgrade making recurring donations? Is that a factor that we can say beyond a reasonable doubt is helping those donors upgrade? And how many times did a broad-based donor donate before they became a major donor? So these are all questions that we want to make sure we put forward in front of teams, and that I hope you all can take back to your own programs, because asking and answering the right questions really optimize how we fundraise, and ultimately we want to make sure that we have ideas and ways that we can operate more like the organizations that are doing that in a faster time frame than ones that just might be taking a little bit longer. For the next myth here, something, again, these are broad statements, but this just comes up over and over again when we start these engagements with different teams, and that's the idea that acquisition is more important than reactivation. Having spoken with so many teams, we know that all these resources are so a lot of times strapped, whether that's time, money. So a lot of times it is hard to place those bets on if we want to focus on acquisition or reactivation. But we came up with a test here just to at least get an idea of if this is true or not. For that, This is another NextAfter staple, something that we get to talk about quite a bit, and that is the donor mountain here. So to help explain these donor life cycles and how we can structure this test here, we have a climbing analogy that we like to use. So at the base camp here, before donors are even on the mountain, we have donor prospects. That first gift, what gets them on the proverbial mountain here, is new donor. They can become a second-year donor if they give 2 years in a row. At the top there is key multi-year. That's anyone that's given more than 3 years in a row. In a second, you'll see just how valuable those donors end up being and why they are at the top there. Like any climbing, unfortunately, you can fall off at certain points and you enter that lapsed file there. But you can still give again, become a reactivated donor, reactivated second year, and still move up to that key multi-year. But for today, we want to test these two. So again, we want to isolate as much as we can and remove those unknown variables. And we just want to see on that first year, whether it's a new donor coming from that donor prospect file or reactivated donors coming off the lapse file, which one is more valuable. For this test, we looked at a whole bunch of different donors and a whole bunch of different lifestyle makeups. What we saw, this is over 900,000 donors that we looked at. When we looked at this, the first thing that obviously stands out for our test here, there's a lot more new donors represented in these programs than reactivated. In fact, it was more than twice. But however, we want to know, are they more valuable overall? So not just if they're represented more, but that initial value in that gift that they're giving, is that more valuable or not? So what we saw is that while there was 57% less reactivated donors, so that could speak to a whole, and again, this all is about the additional questions that we want to ask and answer. There might be a lot of reasons that it's harder to get a reactivated donor off that lapse file. There's 57% less of them. But when we look at the average gift, it was 16% greater for reactivated donors in that first year back. And again, this is just when they move off of that lapse file in that first year back of giving versus a new donor in their first year giving to the organization. Reactivated donors gave 16% more, which allows us to say that when we look at two different ways that donors can get up that mountain and can give to the organization, if they're going up the front way, which a lot of organizations obviously do place a lot of effort on, but if you're reaching out through acquisition channels, if you're trying to raise money that way, the average gift we saw was $87 versus, again, $101 when they move off the lapse file to reactivated donors. So again, when we look at acquisition is more important than reactivation here, we can say that's busted. Lapsed donors give more in their reactivation year than new donors. What's important here is being really consistent with the question you ask and making sure you answer that initial question before you want to dive into other things, because doing this, we saw too, we had all these average values. And again, you can see here, and this is something that we work with a lot of teams on, that key multi-year donor is so much more valuable than these other types of donors and these other types of life cycles. So same that we did with the first myth there, this just leads to additional questions that can help us understand donor value at these different life cycles. Some of the ones, and again, these are ones that if we had more time, I'd love to go through with you all, but we really hope that you can take back to your program and kind of start asking these questions and answering to see how those different values vary. Are new donors or previously lapsed donors more likely to become key multi-year donors is an important place to look. What channels of giving do previously lapsed donors use to reactivate? And while we always recommend segmenting communication in any situation where you can test how people coming off of becoming a donor prospect and moving off of that lapsed donor file, if you can find any real statistical evidence that they're responding to those campaigns in different ways, again, that can help us understand how these different donors at different life cycles behave. So to sum up here, what we uncovered was that when we started with these two initial questions, small donors aren't worth the investment, we saw that in the way that we wanted to test this, we saw more than 50% of those current major donors are starting at the broad base and mid-level ranges. And that second one, acquisition being more important than reactivation, we saw that it was 16% greater, that first gift coming off the lapsed donor file. Now, I started out talking about the initial process that I got from Mythbusters, and while we don't get to do some of the fun stuff they do get to do necessarily, there's a big difference, and that is, again, their show always ended in one of these three ways. They would roll credits and it'd be on to the next question. For all of us in this room here, it just does not end up that neatly. We know that the real insights, the real impact on strategy comes from those follow-up questions. So we need to refine this original process just a little bit. We still want to make sure that we're testing every widely known idea or belief within an organization. We want to make sure that groups and teams are operating with a sound basis in data and reality that's going on with their programs. We want to make sure we're building a test that eliminates as many unknown variables as possible so we can answer that initial question that we set out with without any outside interference really impacting that. We still get to do the fun thing. We still get to say, hey, is this confirmed or busted? I'm probably going to go back to my team and say, hey, we should probably start throwing up more busted and confirmed signs everywhere. That's definitely something that's interesting in ways you can make this engaging for the team. Highly recommend it, but we need one more step here, and that's going to be we got to use those results to inform strategy and future tests. Those learnings are only as valuable as the future tests and the ways that you implement that with the organization. Thank you all so much for your time. Again, I'm Charlie. If you have any questions, if you're a Mythbusters fan, I'll be walking around, or by all means, feel free to reach out, but thank you so much.